We're in a campaign season that seems to ignore the reality of what's actually happening in the state. And it's ignoring this reality at a very fundamental level. So while I see ads on the TV all the time that tell me why I should not be voting for that candidate, very few, frankly, trying to tell me why I should vote for theirs, but certainly why I shouldn't vote for that, I don't see one of the candidates, frankly, in either of the two major parties, talking honestly about the biggest issue that's confronting our state, not just today, but quite frankly has been confronting the state of Illinois for decades, and that's its budget problems. So I'm going to try to bring it all together in what we found. I'm going to talk a little bit about our approach and really what it means. Basically, I think as you all know, and many of you came to our prior brown bag, right now the state is looking at a deficit in excess of $9.4 billion. And that's in a $24 billion general fund. That's a 38% hole in the state's general fund. And to be very clear, that's the fund you care about. 9 out of $10 in the general fund goes to just 4 things: education, health care, human services, public safety. And what I'm here to tell you is our state cannot afford to continue providing those 4 core services at its current levels. It just can't do it. But what's really dramatic is the state hasn't been able to afford providing those services since at least 1995. I mean, data going back to that level shows the state has consistently run deficits in its general fund for 16 years. 16 years. We have a constitution that requires us to balance our budget, but for 16 years, we've run a deficit. Now, the way we've been able to paper over that is highly irresponsible. So what state government is supposed to do is to raise adequate tax revenue to fund its services. And frankly, if it doesn't have the revenue because of the balanced budget requirement, the choices really should be 2. Raise adequate taxes to continue your service levels, or cut them. And that choice is a difficult one for elected officials to put to the voting public. Because polling data confirms right now that there's a real split in the personality of the voting public. The Paul Simon Institute down in Southern Illinois did a poll that shows over half of the voters in Illinois today say we should solve our budgetary problems with cuts, not tax increases. Over half. That, by a greater majority, however, the same people say, but don't cut education, don't cut health care, don't cut human services, don't cut public safety. Well, heck, that's 90% of the budget. You've got a 40% hole. The math doesn't work. Now, why are voters so confused? I think it's a lack of leadership by elected officials, and frankly, it's a 30-year-plus history of state government deceiving taxpayers and voters into believing they could have a certain level of public services without paying for them. Those problems have all come home to roost. So, how to solve these problems? Well, you can't answer that question until you get to another issue. Are our problems caused primarily by overspending? Were they caused by the Great Recession? Or were they caused by tax policy? Well, let's start with overspending. Because if I hear one more time what a profligate spending state we have, my head may actually explode. We did a very simple thing. We took the state general fund that covers these 4 core services, looked at it in 1995. Back in 1995, the governor was a guy named Jim Edgar. No spendthrift, okay? Today, 16 years later, after you adjust for inflation and population growth, we are spending less on those 4 core services than we did under Governor Edgar. Anyone who says dramatic growth in funding services has created our deficit problems really isn't looking at the numbers. And what we have found is after just adjusting for inflation and population, we're well over $1 billion below 1995 levels. And that estimate, quite frankly, is highly conservative and will understate it. Because that estimate is predicated on an inflation metric called the Consumer Price Index, the CPI. Now that's an inflation metric that's really good for the economy as a whole. But because of that, it's not so good for public spending. Here's why. The economy as a whole has a lot of things in it like Pop-Tarts, Clorox bleach, Martire, that state government doesn't buy a lot of. What state, thank goodness, well, go ahead if it's tried. But state government does buy a lot of labor. You think about the public services, education, health, human services, public safety, we fund with our general fund. Vast majority of those line items are the teachers, the healthcare providers, the social workers, the correctional officers. It's labor costs. If you analyze any public spending budget, what you'll quickly discover is 80 to 90% of the expenditures are labor costs. Now there's an inflation metric that does measure change in inflation cost over time. It's the employment cost index. Unfortunately, the federal government didn't publish that inflation metric in the 90s. So we have no way of accurately determining the ECI for that period. We do have it beginning in the year 2000 and going forward. So while we're spending less today than we did under Governor Edgar, we're also spending less today than we did under Governor Ryan. In 2000, we looked at the state's general fund. We adjusted it for inflation and population growth using both the CPI and the more accurate employment cost index, the ECI, to today. And what we discovered is if you use that CPI, the bigger whole economy thing but less targeted to government spending inflation metric, we're spending about $1.3 billion less today than a decade ago in our general fund. Using the employment cost index, we're spending $5 billion less than we did a decade ago. We have the capacity to buy $5 billion less of labor, i.e. the people providing the service today, than what we did a decade ago. So no matter how you look at it, we haven't ramped up spending to the point where it's created a deficit problem, particularly not on public services. Well, that's interesting from a change in spending habits over time, but what about absolute spending levels? Where do we rank there? Very, very low. You look at our per capita wealth, and we rank 13th in the nation, per capita wealth. We rank 43rd in spending as a percentage of GDP. We have the 5th biggest population, 43rd in spending. And when you look at the per capita spending by service area, whether it's education, Medicaid, human services, we rank down in the 40s and 30s. So you have this big, rich state with a large population ranking at or near the bottom in spending in the country. So overall spending levels are low. Spending by service area is low. And spending has been cut in real terms for at least 16 years. Despite all that, we are running a monumental deficit in the general fund. So let's take overspending out of the equation. Then there's the Great Recession. That would be the most convenient excuse for elected officials for the cause of our fiscal problems, because quite frankly, if it's the Great Recession's fault, once we're fully recovered, there's nothing legislators have to do. The economy magically comes back, revenues magically grow, you have a balanced budget again. Yeah, that's an interesting theory, but for that period of time from 1995 to 07 before the recession hit, we consistently ran a deficit in the general fund every single year. It didn't cause the problem. Certainly it made it worse, did not cause the problem. Well then, what about that third possible category? Tax policy. Well, here, Illinois doesn't look so good. There are 4 fundamental elements you look for from a tax policy standpoint for your system to work at the end of the day. Those 4 principles they're straight out of the textbooks. You want your taxes to be fair. Anybody got a problem with fairness in this room? Because you got a problem with fairness, I have to leave now, the whole gig is over. No, fairness, good. Fair, responsive. That just means that you want your taxes to respond to the modern economy. Wherever the economy is expanding, that's where you ought to focus your taxes, because that's how you raise revenue. If, in fact, your taxes don't respond to the economy, if they go where the economy is declining, that doesn't raise adequate revenue to support services over time. That creates a deficit. So responsiveness, good. Stability. You want a revenue source that's relatively stable at the state level, so that even when you go through these historically down economic times, you could be assured that one of your revenue sources won't fall through the floor. Now the way you accomplish stability in a tax system, I'm going to hit that on the head, is to have a very broad base for your sales tax. Why would that stabilize revenue collection? And the answer is actually very easy. Our economy is 70% consumer spending, 70%. Consumer spending does not decline significantly, even during recessions. How much do you think consumer spending in America declined during the Great Recession? Don't know? 0.67%. Less than 1%. Folks still need stuff. They need services, so they still buy it. So if you broadly tax what consumers are really buying in the consumer economy, you're going to have a relatively stable revenue source that's there even during poor cycles. The final principle is going to be the most capitalistic sounding principle of them all. You need an efficient tax system. And yes, these are the principles of sound taxation in a capitalist economy. Now, why we chose the capitalist approach to public finance is pretty simple. See, you finance your public sector out of your private sector. Our private sector happens to be capitalist, so we thought that was a rational choice to make. I hope you all are there with us. Now, an efficient tax system is one that doesn't have really too much of an impact on very important private economic decisions like where someone locates their business or where someone buys a home. You want the private marketplace to determine most of that tax policy at the edges. The only way you mess this principle up is to over-rely on local revenue sources to fund public services like property taxes, rather than funding public services primarily from state-based resources. Why? Simple. If you have a state-based tax, it's one tax, one rate, statewide. If you over-rely on a local revenue source, you got a bunch of different local rates that vary from community to community. And once you really over-rely on that local source, those rates don't vary a tiny bit. They vary like this, depending a lot on the wealth of the community, et cetera. So the bottom line is you have such a dramatic difference from community to community in property tax rate that you inefficiently distort, influence private sector decisions that ought not be impacted by tax policy. Well, as it turns out, while these might be the 4 principles an economist would look for our tax system to work, they would have to physically leave Illinois to find any of them. We're 0 for 4. And not surprisingly, that creates problems. Our problem that it has created is something called a structural deficit. Has anyone heard this term, structural deficit? We've been talking about the structural deficit at least since this organization's been formed in the year 2000. And it's really not a complex concept. It's very easy to understand. If you look at public spending and revenues to support it, so what we did was we said, okay, let's start in the year 2000. Let's assume that in the year 2000, the state actually had recurring tax revenue equal to its recurring expenditures. It did not. It had a deficit, but you could probably tell I'm Pollyanna, so we gave them the benefit of the doubt, right, for the model. If you just adjust for inflation and population growth and assume a normal economy, so to be very clear, you hold public spending flat in real terms. You don't increase a program, you don't expand a program, you don't add a program. You do tomorrow what they did in 2000. If you just adjust for inflation and population growth and assume a normal economy, when you have a structural deficit, your cost growth exceeds your revenue growth, and over time, the deficit grows. In Illinois, if the Great Recession never happened, spending remained constant at 2000 levels. By 2011, the structural deficit would have grown by $3.6 billion. That is how much it would have grown. Now, mind you, there was an accumulated structural deficit to begin with in the year 2000, so the actual structural component of the state's whole was bigger in 2011. But the point is, even if the economy was good, we didn't add, expand, or increase a program, we would have still grown our deficit by $3.5 billion plus in a 10-year period. Tax policy is the problem in Illinois. So how do you fix it? Well, you got to adjust the two states' main taxes, the income tax and the sales tax. Now, two of the things that the tax system needs, fairness and responsiveness, can be accomplished through progressivity in your tax system. A progressive tax system is one where more affluent folks pay a greater percentage of taxes as a percentage of their income than do lower middle income folks. So you have a progressive tax burden where the wealthy pay a little bit more as a percentage of income than poor and middle income folks. Why is that fair? Why is that responsive? Well, the concept of fairness goes all the way back to a gentleman called Adam Smith. You all ever hear of Adam? Adam wrote The Wealth of Nations. He invented capitalism back in the 1750s. You know, Adam theorized that in a capitalist economy, economic growth would always disproportionately advantage the top income classes over everyone else. Their incomes would grow at a rate vastly outstripping middle income families or low income families. So to be fair, you would focus your taxes on these people of affluence who not only derive the greatest benefit, but a disproportionate benefit compared to everyone else. In other words, have people pay taxes primarily out of their growing wealth rather than low and middle income families who'd be paying taxes out of their growing poverty. Because that's precisely what census data tell us has been happening. From 1979 through 07, in Illinois, 80% of the state has either had completely flat or declining incomes after inflation. 80%, 8 out of 10. We're talking household income. Two families working together, filing together. Household income. 80% flat or less. The bottom 60% less. All income growth went to the top 20%. So really, to be fair, those are the folks that need to be paying the most in taxes. To be responsive, to respond to where the economy is expanding, there you go. It's expanding for upper income folks, top 20%. It's just not expanding at the bottom and middle. Well, Illinois has regressive taxation. We focus our tax burden on low and middle income families. Well, that's not fair. And in fact, it's worsening income inequality over time by focusing our taxes at low and middle income families. It's not responsive to the economy, and it's not going to lead to a balanced budget. If you focus your taxes on people who have flat to declining incomes over time, you are losing growth in the economy you can't afford to lose. Now, the best way to resolve this problem is to have a progressive income tax rate structure, much like the federal government has, where as incomes get higher, the marginal rate that applies to that higher income gets a little higher. That's the best way to have in a perfect world, a progressive tax structure. You, this may surprise you, do not live in a perfect world. You're in Illinois. And Illinois has a constitution that requires a flat income tax rate across all income classes. So we're literally constitutionally prohibited from putting in the best fiscal practice, which would be a progressive income tax rate structure. Now, there are ways to design around that. And so one of CTBA's core recommendations is going to be increase the state's income tax rate from its current level of 3% to 5%. And then once you've done that, target tax relief to low and middle income families. Significant tax relief. So that not only will they not pay, in effect, most or any of this income tax expansion, they also won't pay the sales tax increase I'm about to talk about in a second. Now, the way you do that, and it's a very simple thing to do, is you have a refundable tax credit on the income side of the ledger. And just to explain how that works, because it's pretty easy public policy, let's say I'm a low-income worker, and if you looked at CTBA's returns, that's not much of a stretch. Ask Mrs. Martire. All right. Say I qualified for a state refundable income tax credit of $500. But I only owed the state $100 in income taxes. Well, my $500 credit is a lot more than the $100 I owe, so I don't have to pay that $100. That leaves a balance of $400 that I get a check for from the state. Now, why? Well, because income taxes really aren't my burden as a low-income person. Sales taxes, property taxes, excise taxes, those things are what I pay. This allows, through very well-designed and efficient tax policy, to get right to the heart of my actual tax burden through the income tax code. Simple to do administratively, highly effective, highly targeted. You give the relief to the people you want to have tax relief. You shift tax burden to the people you want to shift it to. That's the way to do it. And just so you know, this is great bipartisan policy. It's very much like the federal earned income tax credit. Okay? And I don't know if you know this, but the federal earned income tax credit first passed under Richard Nixon. But it was most greatly expanded by Ronald Reagan. And Reagan described it, and this is a quote, as the single best pro-job, pro-family, anti-poverty legislation Congress has ever passed. It's effective, it's bipartisan, it's easy to administer, and of course Illinois doesn't do it. So we need to start doing it. The second thing we need to do with our tax system is expand that sales tax base to include consumer services. Now, there's a pretty simple reason to do that. I told you already that 70% of all economic activity is consumer spending. But what they're spending on has changed. Used to be, people mostly spent on hard physical items you can touch, like this table, shoes, etc. In fact, back in 1960, 32% of all economic activity in Illinois was the sale of goods. Services back in 1960 represented about 35% of all economic activity in Illinois. Fast forward to 2008, sale of services had declined, sale of goods had declined to 12% of economic activity, going from 32 to 12. That's what we tax. What we don't tax, services, jumped from 35% of our economy to 60. Well, gee, any wonder why that doesn't work? We're leaving the largest and fastest growing segment of our economy entirely out of our tax base. And we're wondering why we don't have a stable revenue source that's here for us during down times. So we suggest that the state expand its sales tax base to include these consumer services. What do I mean by consumer services? Well, first let me tell you what I don't mean. I do not mean things like healthcare services. It is proven that if you increase a copay for healthcare by even $1, low-income families stop getting preventative medical care. That would not be good policy. So we leave that alone. I don't mean business-to-business services. Why? That's tax pyramiding, because think about it. If you tax every transaction from business to business and then tax it again when it comes down to us consumers, you're taxing one transaction about 50 times. It's not transparent, it's inefficient, it's really poor tax policy. Sadly, I don't mean professional services. Bill is a recovering legislator. I'm a recovering attorney, and I was, in fact, I could even boast I was an evil corporate attorney in my past. I did mergers and acquisitions, structured finance, intellectual property, and chaired a couple of those departments for my old law firms, and so there you go. And certainly there are a few of my peers I would love to tax out of existence. But most states don't tax professional services. So whether or not it's a rational thing to do from a tax policy standpoint, one thing Illinois isn't is a state that's willing to lead the nation in a tax change. So we leave professional services out, primarily for political reasons. So what does that put in? Well, into the basket come things like haircuts, lawn care, bowling, health clubs, spray-on tans, that kind of thing. Now, if we suddenly did this, would Illinois become a high-tax state? And the answer is no. All of our neighboring states already tax services far more than we do. Now, in the report, you'll see the specific services we suggest we tax, but interestingly enough, today already, Indiana, Kentucky, and Missouri tax somewhere between 20 and 40 to 50% of them. Iowa and Wisconsin tax all of them and more. And I have yet to see the busloads of people from Iowa come in here to get their haircut. Now, if you've seen their haircuts, they should start coming. But they're not doing it for tax reasons. This would just modernize our system and, in fact, make it more like our neighboring states, which is an interesting point. We're very low tax overall. 13th highest per capita income, 5th largest overall economy, 5th largest overall population, 44th in total state and local tax burden, 44th. And when I say total state and local tax burden, I mean absolutely every tax and every fee charged by any unit of state or local government. As a percentage of our income, we're very low. If we had the tax policy of our neighboring states, we'd have billions more in revenue in our general fund. So at the state level, just isolating out what the state charges in taxes and fees, we take about 7.2% of the income, personal income in Illinois. That's the total, all the excise taxes, et cetera. Missouri takes the same amount. So let's take them out. They have an equal state tax burden to us. Indiana takes over 9%, 9.2. So does Iowa. If we took that extra 2% of personal income in Illinois in taxation like Indiana does, like Iowa does, you know what that would be? $11 billion to our general fund. $11 billion. If we had Kentucky's tax system, we'd have $13 billion more in our general fund. So no. This wouldn't make us less competitive with our neighboring states. This would just make us more like our neighboring states, smaller deficits, and the capacity to fund public services. So what about the proposals that have been put on the table to deal with the problem? Well, this is going to surprise probably most of you in the room. They don't work. Governor Quinn, his most recent and current proposal, is a 1% surcharge for education. And he would add his 1% income tax rate increase to both the corporate and individual income taxes. He would target no tax relief to lower middle income families. He would do nothing to add any stability to the state's revenue system. He just would charge 1% more, supposedly for education. Although some of his more recent comments were, and by the way, buy some property tax relief too. Well, the net tax increase that this 1% surcharge for education would generate, about $2.9 billion. We got a $9.4 billion hole this year. Next year, our starting hole will be close to $13 billion, if not a little north of that, because we have $3 billion in one-time revenue this year, and we're losing a recurring revenue stream in the tobacco litigation proceeds, which we sold off to generate some of that one-time revenue this year. Long story short, we're starting off with a $13 billion hole next year. Quinn's proposal does nothing to eliminate the structural imbalance. It can't fund property tax relief, as he claims. There's just not enough money there. Now, to give him some credit, I don't hear a lot of elected officials running for office telling voters what they need to hear. We have to have a tax increase to solve problems, rather than what they want to hear. We don't need taxes to solve problems. So I give him credit for the courage to tell voters and taxpayers we have to have a tax increase. But if you're going to do a tax increase, it's not like doing healthcare policy or education policy. You can't just get the camel's nose under the tent and hope to incrementally change it every year. Legislators don't vote on tax increases every year. We haven't had one for, I don't know, 30 years now. So net, 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 you better have a tax proposal that works. So Quinn's doesn't meet any of the principles of good tax policy. It does raise some revenue, but not nearly enough to solve problems. Then there's Senator Brady's proposal. It's a little sketchy on the details. But he suggests, and this is close to a quote, that he's going to cut a dime on a dollar in spending to generate $5 billion in total savings. Well, our entire general fund is only $24.9 billion. So cutting 10% of that, a dime on a dollar, is at most $2.49 billion, 2.5. So really, you can't cut by 10% and generate $5 billion in reduced spending. You can't. And you don't really have the full $24.9 billion to cut. Here's why. $5.8 billion of the money that funds our general fund isn't our money. It comes from the federal government, so call it $6 billion. If you cut the federal program, you lose an equal dollar amount of federal funding. So in effect, what you've done is you've cut the service, you've cut your federal funds, and you've left your deficit intact. You've done nothing to move your deficit down at all, right? You've lost the revenue in addition to the spending. The net impact of that is zero. So you got to take that 5.8, call it $6 billion off the table. And so that reduces us down to about $18 billion budget. But of that, we have to spend about $8 billion in own state tax dollars to get the federal money. And this is primarily in education and in healthcare. So now you got to take that off the table too, and that leaves about $10 billion available for the 10% across the board cuts. That will save $1 billion. Now recently, Senator Brady has said that he probably can't realize the full $5 billion from his 10% across the board, and he may have to go up to 20% across the board. I will take him at his word that he will do that, and that in this remaining $10 billion pot of money, he will cut by 20%, saving $2 billion. He has said it consistently, so I'm going to give it to him. Now that remaining pot of money is three things. You've pretty much taken education and healthcare off the table. So it is human services, it is higher education, and it is public safety. That's over 90% of the remaining $10 billion. Human services are programs that, well, over half of them, frankly, 54% of our human services expenditures today go to two things: helping people with mental health and developmental disability problems. You get up to 75% of our human services budget when you add in the Department on Aging and taking care of homebound seniors, that kind of thing. The final 25% of our human services spending are things like child care for single working parents, domestic violence prevention and treatment, abused and neglected children, AIDS prevention and treatment, substance abuse, that kind of thing. In other words, our human services budget is what cares for the most vulnerable members of our society. It's the biggest portion. It's about half of this $10 billion that's left to cut. So it would bear the brunt of the cuts. Just so you know, our fiscal bankruptcy would cause us to engage in morally bankrupt behavior by cutting the services that assist the most vulnerable members of our society. Would have to. Those are just the numbers. All right. The Civic Federation has put a proposal on the table that actually would balance our budget over time, but it would require another $1 billion in cuts from today's current levels, from where we are now. It would require significant cuts to the public employee pension system over time. And on top of that, it would require increasing state taxes collectively by $7.2 billion. Their increases are pretty simple. They have the same 3 to 5% increase in the income tax rate that we support. They think that all retirement income that is taxed at the federal level ought to be taxed at the state level. And while we support adding retirement income into the income tax base, we suggest that you start at $50,000 a year and above in total income, so that you don't hit any truly low to moderate income seniors that are living on a tough fixed income. And by the way, that $50,000 a year in income cutoff level is pretty effective. Only 18% of the filers in Illinois that report any retirement income are at $50,000 or above. So it'd be less than 20%. So we wouldn't support necessarily expanding it to all retirement income. That would make our regressive system slightly more regressive. But on the other hand, it would make it more stable. It's actually a thoughtful proposal. It's something that should go on the table. They suggest increasing the corporate income tax rate just like we do. They also suggest looking at expanding the sales tax base. They don't suggest doing it yet. We suggest doing it right away to add the stability and bring the money in. Our proposal would require no additional cuts. It would raise $7.8 billion in revenue, so $600 million more than the Civic Federation's proposal, but no cuts. And our proposal includes enhanced funding for public schools down the road. In fact, funding education at the level recommended by the Education Funding Advisory Board, EFAB. This would bring school funding up in communities around the state from its current level at the foundation level of about $6,100 per kid to over $8,100 per kid. It's tied into the actual cost of providing a quality education, and it would do a lot to enhance public education in the poorest communities in our state and in middle-income communities in our state. And one thing we discovered from the data is the racial composition of our school system is still very much separate. We're the third most segregated state in the nation when you look at school racial composition. And we're not just still separate, we're still unequal. These majority-minority school districts are starting off with over $1,100 less per kid per school year to spend on education. Well, that has led to a significantly inferior education in African-American communities across Illinois. So much so that the kids coming out of those underfunded schools aren't competitive with their white peers for going on and credentialing themselves and getting good jobs in the modern economy. And I know that because the wage gap between whites and blacks in Illinois has gotten worse by 126% since 1980. And there is a direct correlation between educational attainment and wage. So bottom line is, CTBA's recommendation would turn that around, make the investment in public education, take the pressure off of property taxes to fund schools, hopefully address this racially inappropriate issue while balancing the budget and averting further cuts. Two different views, I guess, of the future of Illinois. CTBA's view is we've cut enough, we haven't funded those essential services to the level that meet the needs of our population. We've hurt vulnerable populations and school children enough. Let's stop cutting. Let's stop lying to ourselves that we could have viable public services without paying for them. And let's raise adequate tax revenue so that we can invest in a better tomorrow. I think that's the better vision. Do I expect at the end of the day that when a budget package moves through Springfield that's got a tax increase, that someone somewhere is going to claim we need to save $1 here or cut this? Yeah, absolutely. Would we at CTBA, even though we think we should not cut spending levels below where they are today, support spending cuts? Well, yeah, if you show us a program isn't needed or wasteful, why fund it? Better take that money and put it into one of these programs that are important, that we do need, but we have cut. Do that. That's responsible. But what we don't want to see happen is what has been happening. The tail has wagged the dog. Everyone's focused on the waste. Everyone's focused on overspending, and none of that is the material problem facing Illinois. The material problem is a tax policy that is unfair, that bankrupts the state, and that makes it impossible to invest in the human and physical infrastructure we need to be competitive in a global economy. So those are the main findings of our report. Thank you all for coming.